name's Jimmy Wilson adjusted his faded Korean War veteran cap as he stepped through the doors of First National Bank on a crisp Tuesday morning. At 86, his once formidable frame had been reduced to a careful shuffle, the movement of someone quietly managing chronic pain from shrapnel wounds embedded decades ago. He never mentioned the discomfort. Not after what he'd seen, what he'd endured on those frozen Korean hillsides so many years back. His modest one-bedroom apartment, sparsely furnished, was a silent museum of a life devoted to service. Each Sunday, without fail, Jimmy would polish the medals in his glass cabinet service honors meticulously maintained, their significance unspoken. He never shared the full stories behind them. They were memories he carried alone. And his only son, who had followed in his footsteps by joining the military, had been killed by an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan in 2006. Since that loss, Jimmy had lived in quiet solitude. He spent most of his days at the local VFW hall, though the younger veterans often overlooked him. His war, after all, felt too far away, a relic of another era. His reserved manner didn't help. When asked directly about his service, he would steer the conversation away with a soft, practiced reply. "Just did my duty, that's all." His eyes, distant, always seemed to be looking past the moment, focused on a horizon only he could see. Recent medical bills had drained what little savings he had left, putting him in danger of losing the only home he had. After weeks of assembling paperwork, Jimmy had finally completed his application for the Veterans Financial Assistance Program, his last chance to avoid foreclosure. As he stood in the bank lobby with his documents in hand, the fluorescent lights above reflected off the designer watch worn by Darren Phillips, the 35-year-old branch manager. Darren scanned the application, his expression tightening with immediate distaste. Another veteran assistance request. "We've been getting a lot of these lately," Darren muttered, his tone steeped in irritation. Jimmy stood patiently as Darren began loudly picking apart his documentation. "These records look unusual," he said, frowning. "I don't see proper digital verification codes." "They're from 1953, sir," Jimmy replied quietly, his voice calm but weathered by years of similar scrutiny. "Convenient," Darren said, not bothering to lower his voice, loud enough for customers nearby to hear. "Our system shows no immediate database match for your service record." A young loan officer, Sarah Mitchell, approached with caution. "Mr. Phillips, many Korean War records aren't fully digitized. Perhaps we could—" "Not now, Sarah," Darren snapped, cutting her off before she could finish. "We have procedures." Indeed, other employees exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered, and a few nearby customers murmured about another fake hero, the words reaching Jimmy's ears. Every time he returned, customer service misplaced his documents, forcing him to reschedule and return again. Meanwhile, wealthy clients were quickly ushered into private rooms. Jimmy, by contrast, was made to wait for hours in the public lobby. During one visit, Darren had even gestured toward Jimmy's hat and said, "Your service cap could have been bought at any surplus store," before signaling to a security guard to keep a watchful eye on him. Today, Jimmy had come prepared, every required document in order, every signature verified. This visit was supposed to be the final step in the approval process. Darren took the military ID from Jimmy's hand and held it under the lobby's harsh lights. "This ID appears suspicious," he announced, his voice amplified for everyone to hear. "The watermark doesn't match our verification standards." Several customers pulled out their phones and began recording. Darren leaned in for effect. "Sir, we take stolen valor very seriously here." "But I did serve," Jimmy said, his voice trembling. "Echo Company, 1952. "Anyone can memorize detail from the internet," Darren interrupted sharply. Tears welled up in Jimmy's eyes as he clutched the latest rejection letter. A younger customer sneered, "My father was a real veteran. This is disgusting." Sarah whispered, "I'm so sorry," as security escorted Jimmy out of the building. The next morning, Jimmy sat alone at his kitchen table, Foreclosure notices spread out beside mounting medical bills. 3 prior applications had already been denied for insufficient documentation, despite his having submitted everything he owned, everything he had ever received. When he called the Veteran Affairs Office, a sympathetic but overwhelmed representative confirmed what Jimmy already knew. Records for veterans of the pre-digital era were often incomplete, and sometimes permanently lost. Our systems weren't designed with Korean War vets in mind, the representative admitted. It's an issue we see more and more. The Regional VA Support Office has a 6-month backlog for record requests. Jimmy didn't have 6 months. Unfortunately, the representative continued, many financial institutions now flag elderly applicants as a high fraud risk, especially those from Korea and early Vietnam. There have been policy changes. Protections for pre-Vietnam vets have been quietly phased out. Jimmy's multiple appeals to the bank's headquarters had gone unanswered for months. A local newspaper buried a short article about discriminatory treatment against elderly veterans on the back pages, but it stirred little interest. The world had moved on. Across town, Darren was proudly recounting the incident during the bank's morning meeting. Another Valor thief shut down, he declared, clearly enjoying the attention. These old guys think they can just walk in with some dusty paper and cash in. A recently leaked internal memo from the bank's CEO encouraged more aggressive fraud prevention measures, specifically prioritizing digital verification over physical documents. The aim, the memo said, was to eliminate bad actors, though its implementation had quietly sidelined a generation of legitimate veterans. Sarah Mitchell couldn't shake her discomfort. Something about Jimmy's demeanor, his steady gaze, his quiet resolve, it all felt real. During her lunch break, she drove to the county library and headed straight to the military archives. With a roll of microfilm and an old reader, she began digging through the past. It didn't take long before she found a partially redacted file that caught her eye. It bore Jimmy's name. The file referenced Operation Forgotten, though most of the details were blacked out. What remained visible was a line mentioning a presidential unit citation awarded to an unspecified special operations group. Curious, Sarah spoke with her grandfather, a Korean War veteran himself. When she described the unit insignia Jimmy had worn, he grew quiet. "Nace, those boys weren't regular infantry," he said. "They went places no one talks about. Some of their missions still haven't been declassified." Sarah pressed further and found an old newspaper clipping mentioning the rescue of 12 missing soldiers by an unidentified hero. The dates matched Jimmy's service period. Still, public opinion was shifting in the opposite direction. A local Facebook group had labeled Jimmy a suspicious character, a possible fraud trying to steal military benefits. Commenters questioned why a real veteran would be so reluctant to talk about his service. Even the local VFW, now dominated by Vietnam and Gulf War vets, often dismissed Korean War stories as exaggerated or irrelevant. In community forums, people suggested Jimmy get a job rather than seek handouts, ignoring his age, physical condition, and the very real sacrifices he'd made. A nearby church group, once a source of community support, declined to assist with his foreclosure, citing uncertainty about his military status. Even in the grocery store, Jimmy overheard whispers labeling him just another old man pretending. A local radio host added fuel to the fire, ranting about welfare seekers in veteran caps looking for sympathy. The public perception grew more toxic by the day. Despite this, Sarah kept investigating. She found Jimmy's name on a restricted memorial list not publicly displayed. Digging further, she discovered references connecting Jimmy to General Robert Hayes, a highly decorated and secretive Korean War commander long rumored to have led off-the-record operations during the conflict. In Jimmy's wallet was a crumpled photo, faded and worn, of 12 young men in winter gear, their faces half smiling through the frost. One was clearly Jimmy. In the background, mountains loomed like silent witnesses. What Sarah now understood was painfully clear. Jimmy Wilson was not a fraud. He was a ghost of a war the country had long tried to forget, a quiet hero whose stories had never been told because they were too painful, too secret, or too inconvenient to remember. And now, like so many of his generation, he was being erased by red tape and public indifference. Sarah knew it was time someone spoke up, because behind Jimmy's silence was not deceit, it was sacrifice. And the world owed him more than just suspicion. She had only caught a glimpse, a handwritten note hastily tucked away, briefly exposed while he fumbled through his wallet searching for identification. It was enough to spark a flicker of suspicion in Sarah's mind. The mission might still be silent, the files still classified, but the Brotherhood endures. That unassuming man, Jimmy Wilson, had something buried deeper than most could see. Later, while volunteering to help him settle paperwork, she noticed his bedside drawer contained a sealed envelope. The bold black letters on the front read, "Open only upon my death. A final testament. Secrets, bound in silence, kept across decades." When Sarah brought her findings to Aaron, hoping he'd see what she saw, he brushed her off without hesitation. Even if he did serve, which I doubt, his paperwork doesn't meet modern verification standards. He scoffed. Darren, their superior, chimed in bluntly. "We can't make exceptions based on sentimentality." "But sir, what if we're wrong?" Sarah pressed, unwilling to let it go. "So? The burden of proof is on the applicant," Darren snapped, ending the conversation with finality. "Besides, I've already reported him to the veteran fraud hotline." That evening, Jimmy sat alone, staring at the sealed letter he'd carried with him all these years. For 70 long years, he'd honored an oath of silence. About places he'd been, about missions that officially never happened, about comrades whose names were buried alongside secrets. Now, that very silence was the wall that stood between him and the roof over his head. He had endured freezing mountain operations, deep behind enemy lines where even maps dared not go. Yet here he was, facing his most demoralizing enemy, bureaucracy. Databases couldn't trace the kind of service he gave. Algorithms didn't know what to do with valor that had been deliberately hidden. How should society treat veterans from earlier conflicts, whose records might be incomplete, destroyed, or still classified? Have we become so reliant on digital validation that we've forgotten how to trust a soldier's word? That following Monday, Jimmy returned to First National Bank one final time. He carried nothing but a worn, faded photograph, its edges frayed from years of handling. It was a last attempt, a final appeal before surrendering to defeat. As he walked into the lobby, the atmosphere shifted, conversations quieted. Phones were subtly raised. His presence was now infamous, thanks to a viral video circulating online, one that labeled him a fraud. Darren emerged from his office immediately, clearly prepared for this confrontation. Mr. Wilson," he announced, his voice loud and performative. "We've confirmed with the proper authorities that your application is questionable, at best." A security guard drifted closer, postured with false caution, though Jimmy stood with hands empty and demeanor composed. "We've contacted the veteran fraud hotline regarding your case, Mr. Wilson," Darren continued, straightening his designer tie, his words echoing with smug finality. "I suggest you leave before this becomes more embarrassing for you." Around them, customers began filming. One woman shook her head in disgust, whispering, "Shameful, fake," just loud enough to pierce through the tension. Behind the counter, employees were already processing paperwork for the foreclosure of Jimmy's modest home. Sarah, documents clutched in her arms, stepped forward again. "Sir, I really think we need to reconsider." "We've seen enough, Sarah," Darren barked, cutting her off. "Security will escort Mr. Wilson out." Jimmy stood still. His dignity remained intact despite the public humiliation. His weathered hands held the photograph with reverence. His eyes, far from angry, reflected only profound sadness. "This is my unit," he said softly, but few were listening. Just as the security guard reached for Jimmy's arm, the bank's double doors burst open with such force that the alarm blared through the lobby. Everyone froze. In the doorway stood a towering figure, commanding and unmistakable in full military dress. 4 silver stars gleamed from each shoulder. General Robert Hayes, now in his 90s, yet radiating the same authority that once led men through hell, strode into the room, flanked by 2 uniformed aides. "Attention!" he barked in a voice forged on battlefields. The room instinctively stiffened. Even the air seemed to stand still. "Which one of you is the manager?" the general demanded. Darren stepped forward, suddenly unsure. I am, sir. Darren Phillips." "You've been harassing one of my men," Hayes interrupted, his voice ironclad. From a worn leather case, he withdrew a folder stamped top secret in faded red ink. "James Wilson served under my direct command during the most classified operation of the Korean War." Darren's face turned pale. The general's words carried the weight of thunder. Sergeant Wilson led a mission behind enemy lines to rescue 12 captured American soldiers. The details of that mission remain classified for national security reasons. Until recently. Hayes opened the folder, revealing documents bearing presidential seals. Wilson received the Silver Star in a private Pentagon ceremony. His unit conducted operations so sensitive their existence was denied for 70 years. He held up a photograph. Young Jimmy, standing at attention, receiving a medal from President Eisenhower himself. "This man," Hayes said, his voice cracking with reverence, "carried 2 wounded soldiers 20 miles through enemy territory on his back." He turned to Darren. "His records were sealed by presidential order. That's why they don't appear in your database." The room was silent as Hayes approached Jimmy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your file crossed my desk last week at the Pentagon. I was there to sign off on your Medal of Honor recommendation." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The general turned his gaze on Darren. "While you were questioning this man's honor, I was finalizing the nation's highest military recognition for his actions." Customers who had been filming only minutes earlier quietly deleted their videos. The bank's CEO arrived, having been summoned directly by the general's office, and immediately issued a profuse apology. "Mr. Wilson never spoke of his heroism," Hayes said, "because his comrades' missions remain classified. He kept his oath silence for 70 years." Sarah stepped forward and handed Jimmy a file, a record of every time his application had been rejected, despite having documentation. He looked at her, gratitude in his eyes for being the lone believer when no one else would listen. Darren tried to recover, stammering, "We had no way of knowing." "Yes, you did," Hayes cut in. "You had his word as a soldier. That should have been enough." Jimmy finally spoke. His voice was soft but unwavering. "I didn't come for recognition. I just needed to keep my home." Hayes's hand remained on his shoulder. "No more, old friend. The country remembers now." Have we become a society too quick to judge based on appearances and database entries? How many have we humiliated simply because their service predates digital systems? What is true respect? Believing the uniform or verifying it with a barcode? First National Bank immediately approved Jimmy's loan, offering preferred terms and waiving all fees. The CEO announced company-wide policy reforms for veterans of earlier conflicts, establishing what would be called the Wilson Protocol, a new standard for handling pre-digital military records with dignity. Jimmy's story sent shockwaves across the nation, triggering a congressional investigation into the treatment of elderly veterans. Lawmakers uncovered thousands of similar cases. Men and women whose only mistake was serving in an era when records were sealed, lost, or stored in forgotten paper archives. Darren was reassigned to mandatory compliance training, now focused specifically on veteran verification processes. Sarah, on the other hand, received a promotion, appointed as the new Veteran Services Specialist at the bank's headquarters. Her task? To build training programs that recognize legitimate but unusual service records. The National Banking Association followed suit, adopting new legacy veteran verification standards, ensuring that no hero would ever again be doubted simply because the sacrifice couldn't be found in a spreadsheet. "Security! We have a fraud trying to claim veteran benefits." The bank manager's voice rang through the lobby like a gunshot. With a scowl twisted in righteous indignation, he snatched the military ID from the elderly man's hand and without pause, ripped it in half. Gasps echoed through the room. The 86-year-old veteran stood motionless, silent tears carving tracks down his weathered cheeks. Customers whispered, some recording with their phones, others shaking their heads. "Shameful fake," a woman hissed, just as the double doors burst open. In strode a 4-star general, his presence unmistakable, his fury barely contained, transforming his face into a mask of wrath. The room fell into stunned silence. All eyes were on the old man, on this supposed fraud, whose only crime had been keeping secrets too heavy to bear and too dangerous to share. What classified war secrets had this man carried for decades? And how would the truth demolish the arrogance of those who dared to strip away his dignity? What followed next would alter the course of an entire community. Jimmy's modest home, once on the brink of foreclosure, was saved, not by charity, but by honor. Local veterans, moved by the unfolding truth, rallied to complete long overdue repairs. They replaced his leaking roof, fixed the broken furnace, and restored what time and neglect had eroded. The tide began to turn. First National Bank, shamed by the incident and awakened by the truth, took unprecedented action. They established the Wilson Fund, named in honor of Jimmy Wilson, to assist veterans with incomplete documentation, providing bridge financing while proper military records were uncovered. No longer would bureaucracy deny dignity. In Washington, the ripple grew into a wave. General Hayes, the very man who had entered the bank that day like a forced reckoning, launched a national campaign to identify other forgotten heroes, veterans whose classified operations had left them without proper acknowledgement, recognition, or access to the benefits they had rightfully earned. At the Pentagon, red tape was shredded as urgency replaced indifference. A special initiative expedited the declassification of select Korean War special operations. These weren't just documents. They were lives, missions, legacies hidden behind top-secret stamps. What once was shadow now came into the light. And a new rallying cry swept across the nation. A nation's character is measured by how it treats those who sacrifice during its darkest hours. The message struck a deep chord. Local schools initiated living history programs, inviting Korean War veterans into classrooms to share their experiences, many speaking publicly for the first time. The media, once fixated on stories of stolen valor, shifted focus to stories of forgotten valor, finally giving a platform to those who had long been silenced by secrecy and shame. Community members organized belated welcome home parades. For many Korean War veterans, it was 70 years overdue. Flags waved, tears fell, and salutes were finally returned. These weren't just parades, they were redemptions in motion. In banking circles, the ripple became reform. Staff training now included a powerful new section titled Honor Before Verification. It taught employees how to approach sensitive documentation processes with dignity, humility, and respect. No longer would misplaced suspicion eclipse silent service. The VFW headquarters introduced special recognition for pre-Vietnam veterans, finally acknowledging the unique challenges they endured. Forgotten wars, denied medals, buried missions, and lives spent in quiet service without validation. Military historians joined the movement, poring over declassified archives to document previously hidden operations, attributing names and honor to those who had lived their entire lives in the shadows. Then came the moment that no one could have predicted. 6 months later, in a solemn White House ceremony, Jimmy Wilson was awarded the Medal of Honor. The president pinned the medal to his chest as thunderous applause rose in the East Room. This wasn't just a medal. It was vindication in gold and silk. Back in town, former skeptical bank customers lined the streets as Jimmy returned home. They waved flags, held signs, and clapped with newfound reverence. They no longer saw an old man with a suspicious ID. They now understood what quiet heroism looked like. Jimmy didn't retreat from the attention. Instead, he visited the local high school, standing tall as students gathered, curious and reverent. For the first time, he told his story publicly. "I kept silent for my brothers who didn't come home," he said, his voice steady, eyes scanning the young faces before him. "Their mission still protects you today." The room was so quiet you could hear hearts breaking. In the crowd sat the former bank manager. He had come alone, no longer armed with doubt, just regret. As the ceremony ended, he stepped forward awkwardly. Jimmy extended his hand without hesitation. "We all make mistakes," he said simply. Inspired by the ordeal and the redemption that followed, Jimmy's daughter Sarah established a scholarship, one for students studying forgotten military history, ensuring no story like her father's would ever go untold again. The bank lobby was transformed. Its cold, impersonal walls now bore framed photographs of local veterans, among them a young Jimmy in his mountain warfare uniform, staring out with the quiet strength of a man who carried 100 missions and 1,000 secrets behind his eyes. In the final scene, we find Jimmy not basking in medals or speeches, but seated beside another veteran at the VA hospital, holding his hand, speaking softly, sharing stories. He had not changed. Not really. He remained a man of duty, still serving, still giving. To a group of visiting students, he offered the wisdom forged in the silence of decades. "The greatest honor isn't the medals," he said. "It's serving alongside heroes whose names you'll never know. These are the men who walk among us every day, unrecognized, unhonored, yet unmatched in sacrifice." Have you ever discovered someone's remarkable past that made you see them differently? Has someone's untold story ever made you reconsider judgments you once held? Share your experience in the comments. Subscribe to follow more stories of vindication, recognition, and the silent hero's history almost forgot. At American Valor Stories, we don't just tell stories, we restore honor. This is where forgotten warriors receive long overdue justice, where a lifetime of silence finally finds a voice, and where you, the viewer, can witness the moment when respect is finally given. If your heart has ever stirred at the sight of delayed recognition, join us.